Welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to introduce how to do animation using CSS properties and how to animate those different properties. So we're not going to start with where we left off because there's a lot going on in that file, and it'd be easier to teach this in a way where we have simple things, and then you can apply what you've learned maybe to some of the elements in this or elements in your own project. So let's go ahead and get started by creating two new files. So I'm going to go into VS Code, and I'm going to create one file. I'm just going to call it animation.html. And then I'm going to go ahead and create, surprisingly enough, an animation.css file as well. Okay. So let's get started with, we're going to go ahead and copy and paste some things really quick. So I'm going to go to the position.html file that we just had open last. And I'm actually going to move this over a bit so you can all see this. Here we go. Okay. All we're going to do is we're just going to copy and paste basically, to the top body tag. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go back to my animation.html. I do not need to worry about Java right now. I'm going to go ahead and paste this. And before I do anything else, I want to fix this one thing because this caught me up earlier. I want to make sure that I change this from position.css to animation.css, right? So I'm referencing the right file. Otherwise, I'm going to be making changes to animation.css and then nothing will be happening. No change will be occurring on my page. And then instead of positioning, we're just going to call this animation so we can tell what that is. And then we just need to create a closing body tag and then a closing HTML tag. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. So there's space between body and body. And to start with, we're just going to create a div. We're just going to type in div, and we're not going to put anything in there. It's just going to be a div tag. We're essentially just going to make a block that we can start to animate. And then we'll look at some other elements and animating those as well. Okay, so we've got our div. Let's go ahead and go to our animation.css. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to create a body selector, but we're not going to put anything in there yet. We're going to save that, but then it's just up at the top of the page, and we know it's there. So then let's just go ahead and create our div selector. And in this div selector, let's go ahead and just define our width to be 100 pixels and our height to be 100 pixels. And what we're going to start by animating is we're going to show some of the simple animation techniques, just animating color before we start animating position or anything else like that. So we're just going to type in background. We want background color. So if I type in background, and the second option there is color. And then you can choose whatever color you want to be the default color of this object. Basically, we just don't want it to be white so it stands off against the background. I'm going to do turquoise. That seems good. Okay, so then how do we animate things? Well, much like in Photoshop or After Effects or Premiere or really any program that does motion graphics, there's something called keyframes, right? And keyframes are essentially points in time where you tell the computer something about a particular property, and then you go to another point in time and you tell the computer about something else about that particular property. Like say at time 0, my background color should be turquoise, but at 4 seconds, my background color should be red, something like that, right? And what the computer does is then it interpolates or basically makes decisions on how to get from the color you're at to the color you want to be at over the number of frames that it has between those two keyframes, right? So the amount of time between those two keyframes, it evenly divides that blend across those things. Or if it's motion or change in scale or whatever it may be, it automatically or it very gently changes those across time. Okay, so we've got the width, we've got the height, we've got our background color. So let's go ahead, and so what we need to do is we need to make keyframes. And to create keyframes in CSS, we start with the @ symbol, and then we say just, if we type in key, and this very first option actually gives us all the syntax that we need to start making keyframes. And this word identifier basically means we need to fill in a name for this animation. And so let's just call this, we'll call it anim1. Really exciting stuff. And the most basic form of this is just to give basically the start, what happens at the start of the animation and what happens at the end of the animation. And we'll look at the other way to do a little bit more with this. But to start, we type in the keyword from, and then we do opening and closing squiggly brackets, and then we put the property in there that we want to change. And in this case, we're going to be animating our background color. So we could just go ahead and copy this background color turquoise, that whole line with the semicolon, and we can go ahead and paste that in there. And then we need to say we're going to go from this color to whatever color we want. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this into the to field again, but then I'm going to go ahead and change my color. I don't know, I said red earlier, but a nice orange might be a nice change. Okay, and so this is all we need within our keyframes. Is all we're defining here are the keyframes. Notice that we don't tell it when in time each of these things happens, and we've just defined the property that's going to be modified. So how do we access this? How do we make sure that this div gets this animation? So what we need to do is we need two things in here. First, we need to type in animation, and you'll see the first one actually has everything in one line, but we're going to change that a little bit. We're going to say animation name is the first thing that we want, and we want to set it to anim1, whatever this identifier was here. And then the other value we need is the animation duration. Right? And so we've got this animation duration, and note it's 0ms or 0s. That gives us a sense that we can either have this animation last a number of milliseconds if we want it to be very quick, like less than a second. But if we want it to be greater than a second, we could either use thousands of milliseconds, or we could do this in seconds. I'm just going to have this be 4 seconds to start with. That's a good start, right? It doesn't take long to animate. We'll see it happen. So we've said the div has this animation name, and we've set this animation duration. So let's go ahead and save this. And let's go to our animation HTML file, make sure we save that as well. And then something that some people have been having issues with is when you go to debug, it tries to send your file, it tries to launch Chrome. I'm going to click debug anyway. Let's see if this happens. It says it's unable to attach to browser. And so there's some little error here, but it doesn't really matter. What we want to do is we want to go to our files. And if I just right click on animation.html and go to copy relative path, come over here and paste this path in here. Oops, that's not what I wanted to paste. Go here, copy relative path, come over here, and oh, I don't want the relative path. I keep doing the wrong thing. I want to copy the path and then go ahead and paste this in here. There we go. Right. And so now I've got this box that animates one time, and it goes through and it cycles through that color. So if I refresh this, right, it's going to start again. It's going to cycle through, and then you'll see it pops back to whatever the default color was at the end of the animation. So to make that a little more clear, right, if I change this base value to, I don't know, magenta, if I can actually hover, I can hover over this. There are some things in this that really drive me crazy. So if I save this, I come over here and I refresh this file, it should pop back to magenta. Okay, yep, so there it goes, right? You'll note that it starts out because, right, as soon as it loads, it starts at turquoise, and then it goes and cycles through. Now, what if I want this to not just cycle one time, but what if I want this to be continuous? Right. So then what I need to do is I need to say animation iteration count is what I want, right? Because this is how many do I want. And right, you can set this numerically. You can say 3, 5, 10, 100. You can also, if you just want it to loop forever, as long as the window's open, you just click infinite. If I go ahead and save this and render this, right now it should, or refresh, I keep saying render, refresh, but it should just continue to animate over and over and over again. And you'll note it never goes to the pink because it just jumps right back to the first value that we put in there. Okay, so let's look at some, while we've got this going, let's look at a couple other settings we can do. First, what I'd like to do is I'm going to have my width set to auto. Right, and what that's going to do, right, is it's going to make it so that it takes up the entire page. Now you'll note that there's this boundary around here. And so if I go up to my body tag, by default, the body tag has a small margin. So if I just type in margin and say 0px and save this and come back over here and refresh, right, then it will get rid of that margin and my div will take up the entire window. Okay, so I've got this div, but let's go ahead and we're going to name this, we're going to make this a class. We're going to call this div.first. Something to note, you can't lead this value with a number, right? Whatever this name is here, the class name, it has to start with a letter, but it can have a number inside of it once you've had that first letter. So that's just something to note. So I've got first, I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to go ahead and paste this again, and I'm going to call this one second. Now, I could be doing this with IDs as well, but we're just going to do it with classes instead. So I'm going to go ahead and save this for a second, and what I need to do is I need to hop back over to my animation HTML. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste my div, and then what I need to do is I need to make sure I tell it which one is which. So I want to say class equals first, and then down here class equals second, right? And just remember the everything that you need for that. I'm going to save this, I'm going to refresh, right? And now I've got these two divs that are animated, right, in time with one another. Okay, so CSS, the way that this is set up, there are, right, these keyframes are independent of the elements that they're animating, right? So I'm essentially reusing them in two places, right? I've just defined them once, I'm reusing them twice, but I can create variation in that by adjusting the duration of each of these elements. So if I make one of these, say, oh, I don't know, 7 seconds long, and I go ahead and save this and I refresh, right, now they're still cycling through, but they're doing it at different rates, right? And so they're still going to and from the entire thing, but they're doing it at slightly different speeds. Now, the other thing I can do is if I go ahead and set this back to 4, I can come down to this second one. And one of the other things parameters I can set is the animation delay. So if I go ahead and click on animation delay, and I say, let's just say 1 second delay, and save this, right? Then the first one is going to be delayed, or the second one's going to be delayed before it starts animating. Now note, once the animation begins, it doesn't have that delay anymore, but it essentially offsets these two things, right? So you can imagine some of the patterns and things that you could create if you were to have many, many divs down this page, and you were having these things offset by a little bit in order to cycle through the different settings. So we've got some of the basics down. Let's go ahead and push forward just a little bit. So we're going to go ahead and we'll have a third div. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this div second, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it here. I'm going to call it third. And in this case, we're going to, we'll leave everything the same for now, but we're going to go ahead and create a new set of keyframes and look at one of the more, how we can set multiple keyframes across the entire animation. So if I say @key and hit enter, and then I'm going to call this anim2 as my thing. This, you could say basic keyframes or whatever. So instead of just from and to, if we want to be able to make like have it be, say, turquoise here and green and then violet and then I don't know, black. What we need to do is we need to be able to split that up and tell the browser at what point in time during this animation we want these things to happen. And the way we do that is we just say 0% and then opening squiggly brackets. And we can, let's go ahead and say we want this color to be turquoise. Right? And then we're going to keep this simple. We're going to say at 50%. And let's go ahead and just copy this whole line. And then we're going to say at 100%. And we're just going to do 3 to make our lives a little bit easier today. So we're going to start with turquoise, and then let's go to something completely different, like this bright green. And then let's go to like a magenta. Okay, so we've got these 3 things. Now, right, currently our third is still set to anim1. So let's go ahead and change that name. I'm going to go ahead and make this a little bit longer. I'm going to make it 10 seconds long. I'm going to get rid of the animation delay because we don't need that. And I'm going to have the background color just be turquoise again. So I'm going to go ahead and select this, delete it, and just put in turquoise. There we go. Just so it starts where we want it to start, so there's no confusion there. Okay. And now what we need to do is save this, and we need to go to our animation HTML file, and we need to make a new div. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy, paste, and then change the class to third. Okay, I'm going to save this. I'm over here, and I'm going to refresh this page, I think. Oh, I misspelled third. There we go. You got to spell it right for it to work. Okay. So now you can see it goes to green, right? And then it should eventually go to magenta. And then it is going to pop back to teal. Now, one of the things that we can do is if we want this to smoothly cycle through these colors and loop nicely, all we need to do is go back to our animation.css file, and let's go ahead and change these. Let's make this 25%. Let's make this 75%. And then let's take our 0% and copy it and paste it down here and set that to 100%. Right? So now it's going to be starting at turquoise, cycle through these other 2 colors, and return to turquoise over the time of our duration. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come back here and I'm going to refresh. And now when it goes back through, it should go from this back to turquoise, and it should just endlessly cycle. Okay. So I've got these 3 animating in color. So now let's look at animating other properties. So one of the other properties we can animate is the position. So let's go ahead and we'll just copy our keyframes here because, well, let's just start with the basic one. Let's go ahead and copy this. We're going to come down here. We're going to paste it. We'll call this anim3. And with from, we are going to change that from background color. Let's go ahead and just select that whole line in there. We are going to instead call this, let's go ahead and just say left, right? Because we're going to basically be moving this from the left, and we want it to start at 0px. And then we want it to go to, we want the left to end up at, let's just say 400px. And let's go ahead and go back to our animation.html. We're going to create another div, and we will call, let's just call this one, we're going to call this one move as our class. And we're going to need to make that class in our CSS file, but let's go ahead and save this. We're going to go to animation test, or sorry, we're going to go to animation.css. I should just get rid of those other files, but that's right. I'm going to come up here and we have our third. I'm going to go ahead and copy our third and paste it here. And I'm going to call this move. Now, one of the settings we need to change is we don't want the width to be auto. I mean, we could add, that would actually basically move this boundary of our div, which might be kind of cool, but let's go ahead and set it to 100 pixels so we just have like a box moving across the page. We can leave the animation, the background color to turquoise. We're going to change this name of our animation to move. And let's do this over 5 seconds instead of 10. And we're going to leave that to infinite. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to refresh. And for some reason, it is not moving. Oh, because I called it the wrong thing. Right? It's not moving because there is no keyframe set called move. There is a keyframe set called anim3. So let me go ahead, and I could either change it to move down there or just change it to anim3 up here, which is what I've chosen to do. So let's go ahead and try this again. But this still isn't working. So one last thing I need to add that I forgot is, in order for this to actually move, we need to change the positioning, right? Right now the position is static by default, right? We talked about that in the previous thing, which means it's glued to wherever it is. But what we need to do is we need to say position, and either position relative, and absolute might work as well, but we want this to be relative so that what it's going to do is, in our case, it's going to be, it won't, if it was absolute, it would pop it all the way up here and it'd be animating on top of this, which might be cool. But what this will do, what relative will do, is means it's going to start wherever it would normally be in the order of the page, and then it'll animate from around in that position, right? So if I go ahead and save this and I refresh this, right, now this is animating, right, across our page. And you'll note that by default, the animation starts out slow, speeds up across the middle, and then slows down again, right? Which is, it's called easing. And it basically makes life a little bit nicer. It's a more natural feeling animation. You can probably do linear as well. I haven't looked into that at all yet. Okay, so we've got our from and to. And right, so we're doing that, but let's go ahead and see what happens when we make some changes here. I mean, first we could just say, like, let's go ahead and say absolute here. And save this and refresh this. Oh, and it seems like it's still doing the same thing. So it doesn't really care which way we go about this. Okay, so let's go ahead and make some adjustments to this animation, right? Let's go ahead and maybe we can do some different types of movement here. So let's actually, before we do that, let's try and make this go diagonal. So we're going to say left is 0, and we can add additional things in here. So we can also say top is 0 px here, and a semicolon. And then down here we can say top is equal to, let's say, I don't know, 300 px. So if we go ahead and save this and we refresh this, there we go. Oh, so somehow I didn't hit the right key. So now, because I have it positioned absolute, it is sliding across all of these other elements, which actually looks pretty awesome. But let's go ahead and put this back to relative real quick so that everything works right. There we go. Right, so it's animating in a diagonal now because we're setting those two values. Now, we can also, it doesn't have to just be position, right, we could actually also take our background color. And so I'm going to copy this from Anim 2. And I can paste the background color in here. And I can bring down, maybe, let's just have it go to magenta. I can copy this. And I can go ahead and paste this down here. I can hit save. I can bring this over and refresh this, right? And so now, as it's moving, it's also animating that color property. So, right, there are tons of different possibilities for how we do this. And you can imagine, right, if we then were to go to this 0, 25, 75, 100, right, we could actually have this move, right, around in a kind of in a box shape, or we could have all sorts of other variations in this motion. And depending on how quickly we want something to move, or if we want it to hang out for a bit, we can also, basically adjust like what these percentages are. I've used whole even values here, but we could very easily say, and this will just be applied to color, I could say, well, this should go until, let's say 45%, and then this should go to 55%, right? So it's going to very, very slowly go to green, then very quickly go to magenta, and then very slowly go back to turquoise. So let's go ahead and just see what that does really quick, right? So it's very slowly going to green. It should very quickly then go to magenta. Yeah, you saw how fast that was. And then it's going back to the other value again, right? So there's a ton of different possibilities for how you do these animations. You could create really, really complex animations. Essentially you could have 100, I don't know if you can do decimal points in here. So you could have at least 100 unique keyframes in a single animation if you wanted to have really fine-tuned control over the animation. Okay, so these are some of the properties and things that we can animate. Now, we've been doing this just with our divs, but let's go ahead and create an image selector. And I don't know if we're going to need any width and height information, but let's set our position to relative. And let's go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and copy these things from move, the animation name, duration, etc. And I'm going to have those in there. Let's go ahead and save this. And then let's go to our animation HTML file. And down below this div, let's go ahead and type in img and src equals double quotes. And then I'm going to go ahead and choose, I think I want this one. So I'm going to right click and say copy relative path, and it's 04 layer 5. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this in here. And then I'm going to go ahead and close this off. I'm going to hit save. And just as, and then I probably need a class on here. Actually, I haven't even given a class. Let's just double check. Yeah, it's just the img. Okay, because we only have one. So let's go ahead and refresh this. And there we go. Now it looks like there's this weird connection on here, right? Because this object is right directly below that div that we put in there. So they look like they're glued together. And then because there's a transparent background on this, the color here is also changing, right? That's the background color that we left on that same animation that we just did. Now, right, one of the other things we could potentially change is blend mode or opacity. So let's go ahead and do opacity. That should be interesting, right? So we've already got this from and to here with these many different items. So let's go ahead and come in the front of our list. I'm going to type in opacity. And I'm going to start this at 100%, semicolon. And I'm going to say opacity 0%, semicolon. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And let's go ahead and refresh this. All right, and so now that slowly becomes transparent as it goes across the page and moves. All right, so there's other things that we can animate as well. let's go ahead and look at animating transforms really quickly, and then we will be done with this tutorial, and I'll kind of show you another resource for, other things. But basically, any CSS property that is not either on or off, you can animate. I mean, even if they are like on or off, like say, you have something positioned relatively and then you position it absolute. I believe you can even animate between those two, but it's just going to be a pop in the middle of the animation, right? It's not going to slowly change from one to the other. It should just be a switch on and off. But let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and create, let's create something. Let's go ahead and just copy this anim2. We're going to paste it down here. We're going to call this, we could call it anim4 at this point. And our percentages, let's go ahead and do, instead of colors, we're going to do transforms, and we'll comment these guys out, or comment one of these out and actually make this thing be the transform. So we're going to say transform, and then we are going to say rotate, and let's just say, to start with, it's going to be 0 DEG, right? 0 degrees. Then at, we'll leave it 45 and 55. It'll be strange. So then we're going to go ahead and copy this and paste this here. And let's say that we want at 45%, we want to be at 45 degrees. No, we're going to go in 3. Well, let's just do it this way. No, let's say we want to be at 135 degrees, something like that. And then we are going to go ahead and paste in here, and we will say, let's make this 180 plus 15, 195 degrees. And then this last one, we are going to have be, let's just say 360 degrees. Now, make sure that you didn't make any errors in there. Like I have 2 semicolons, so that probably wouldn't cause an error. It's just good to clean that up. And elsewhere, the D got deleted, and so I had to re-put that in. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to come to my animation.html, and just for the time being, I'm going to select this line. Actually, I'm going to select these 2 lines. I'm going to hold down Shift, Alt, or Shift Option A, comment those out. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I'm going to go ahead and paste it. And I'm going to change this class to, I'm going to call this rotate. And I'm going to need to save that and go back to my animation.css. And I've got this animation 4, but what I'm going to need to do is make one more div that is, that we're going to change this class name to rotate. And I'm going to leave everything else exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh this. Oh. And I'm going to say, well, I made some mistake here. Rotate. Let's see, what did I do wrong? Did I not save this? Oh. The image is gone. Move should be gone as well. But you know what may be happening is that it may have tried to do a block. Let's see here. Let's add that, and let's add this and see if that at least gets rid of these 2 things. Oh, so, $10 to whoever can tell me what I did wrong here. The issue is that I left the animation set to anim3 instead of changing it to anim4. Oh, the joys of copying and pasting. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh. So there we go, right? So you can see, right, it very slowly stops, and then it quickly picks up and does this other part, right? So I did like a really bad job with the rotation because of the way that I set it up, right? It gets somewhat close, and then it quickly snaps over a little bit further. And I think the 195 should probably actually be more like 215 is probably a better setting here. There we go. Right, so you can kind of see, and it's kind of lumpy and slow, and that's because of the way that I animated this. If I was to have said 0, and then what would I want? I mean, really, I could have, something else in here, but 0 to 180 to 360 is really what I want. So maybe I could just get away with 3 of these. So let's go ahead and say 50%. Let's just get rid of this entirely. And let's save this and let's refresh this. Right. And so now, right, it goes, and you'll note it does that easing, right? But so it goes and it does its full rotation now over our 5 seconds. Okay. So we can do rotation, we can do movement, right? There's no reason why we couldn't have both of these at the same time, right? So if we just say left 0 px, and then we can say, how about left 300 px? Oops, and I forgot you'll notice that it's got that highlight there, which means that I made a mistake, which is I forgot to put a colon in there. And then I can say left 0 px. We can save this. We can refresh this, right? And so now it rotates and spins as it goes across the page, right? So you'll notice there's some artifacts happening here. There's nothing we can really do about that as far as I know. Maybe there's a way to turn on anti-aliasing or something that I haven't watched. Right, so this is some ways that we can actually do really simple animations, or we have the room to make really complex animations using CSS. And again, any property should be something that you can animate. Okay, that's the end of this tutorial. The only other thing I want to say is, again, I feel like I'm advertising W3 Schools all the time. They have this animations under CSS Advanced in the CSS sets that goes through and talks about some of the other things we haven't talked about in here and what they do. It's got examples of all of it. And yeah, there's really, there's a lot more you can do. You can actually do speed curves if you're interested with, right, changing that timing from linear, and I talked about easing. And yeah, there's all sorts of exciting things you can do. So I definitely suggest playing and continuing to learn more about this. It's a really, really useful tool.